Hello and welcome, this is GFN News on GFN-TV. I'm your host Joanna Junak. In today's news, the Belgian Superior Health Council now supports vaping as a safer alternative to smoking. In the United States, the FDA seems to have backed away from its decision to take JUUL off the market. Consumer advocate John Summers will share his thoughts on vaping in the UK today. And after the news, Brent Stafford of Regwatch interviews Rodu, Professor of Medicine at the University of Louisville in Kentucky and the winner of this year's Michael Russell Award. Belgian Superior Health Council has delivered a report which supports vaping as a safer alternative to smoking, or as a quid aid which can lead to a significant reduction in health risks. The report also states that vaping is not risk-free and is therefore not recommended for non-smokers, especially the young, recommending that further long-term safety data are needed. Dr. Colin Mendelsohn, tobacco treatment clinician, founding chairman of the Australia Tobacco Harm Reduction Association, commented on the report on his blog. He shared with us his personal thoughts on why Belgium supports vaping, while in Australia the authorities are against it.
Yes, look, what's happened recently is that the Belgian Superior Health Council did a review of all the evidence on vaping. It took about 2 years. It was a comprehensive review, and they came to a very sensible, evidence-based and balanced approach to vaping. So they concluded quite rightly that vaping is a far safer alternative to smoking, as we know it is. They concluded that it's an effective quitting aid, which could especially help a lot of the vulnerable smokers in that disadvantaged group, and lead to significant reductions in disease and illness in the country, as you would expect. They were very clear it's not for non-smokers, especially young people, but they recognised also that very few non-smokers were vaping regularly. So that's a really important observation. They did comment that the long-term risks are unknown, which is quite reasonable. So it's best to use vaping in the short term from a health point of view, unless there's a risk of relapsing back to smoking. And they recommended that conventional cigarettes should be more difficult to access than vaping, which is sensible. And they support the availability of vaping as a consumer product for adult smokers. And they wanted to see more education for smokers because there's so much misinformation worldwide about vaping. So that was considered a high priority. And they recommended a proportionate approach to regulation. So vaping to be regulated at a different level to that of smoking, which is of course a much higher risk product, and low excise to encourage people to make that switch. Australian authorities came out recently with a very different analysis of the data. So they looked at the very same evidence and came to a very cautious and restrictive view of vaping. They see vaping as a threat. They see it as something we just aren't ready to accept yet. And their assessment, and that's of the National Health and Medical Research Council, which is our peak health body, was mostly focused on the potential risks of vaping. The risks were exaggerated. They attributed a number of risks to vaping which are not valid, things like EVALI and seizures. They attributed vaping as a gateway to smoking, which of course we know it isn't. And they failed to acknowledge the benefits of vaping. They're very selective in the data that they selected. So really their assessment is not based on the scientific evidence. It's based more on a traditional ideological approach and moral concerns about vaping. And it's based on an abstinence-only approach, a zero nicotine tolerance policy. And there are other issues in the background, things like we have enormous financial benefits from smoking. There are huge taxes available from taxing cigarettes, which obviously are a threat to our treasury. There's a huge mistrust of big tobacco, and that's being used as an argument against vaping. Of course, it's not relevant, but it's constantly raised. And there's political risk. I mean, there are concerns amongst politicians if they allow vaping, there's more harm to the political side of the issue for them. So basically, they've chosen to be overcautious about vaping for all the wrong reasons. And I think it's a very short-sighted, misguided approach, which will end up costing Australian lives.
We will now return to the situation in the United States, where the FDA on June 23rd ordered JUUL to pull its products from the market. But there have been developments since. What's been happening, Will?
Things moved rapidly, Joanna, after the FDA's June 23rd marketing denial order to JUUL caused shock in the THR community. First, JUUL immediately sought and obtained a court-ordered emergency administrative stay, allowing its products to temporarily remain on sale. This seemed like the first step of a major legal battle. But the bigger news came on July 5th with an announcement from the FDA itself. After reviewing JUUL's legal filings, the agency said that it, quote, determined that there are scientific issues unique to this application that warrant additional review. And so the FDA is temporarily suspending the marketing denial order while that additional review is carried out. This all feels rather extraordinary, given that the FDA had already taken nearly 2 years in reviewing JUUL's PMTA applications. Just 2 weeks after ordering JUUL off the shelves, the FDA appeared to be backing away from its own decision, at least for now.
Where do things go from here?
The implications, as so often during this opaque PMTA process, are unclear. Reporting for Filter, Alex Norsha wrote that either the FDA could simply be taking time to bolster its marketing denial order before engaging in a court case, or that it could end up backtracking entirely. We don't know to what extent the FDA and JUUL, which I'll mention again has provided grants to Filter, could be communicating behind closed doors. The outcome, as we speak, is very hard to guess. What we do know, as Helen Redmond wrote for Filter this week, is that enormous damage has already been done. Millions of former smokers use JUUL, and their access is the bottom line. People may object to JUUL's early marketing campaigns and the ensuing PR damage, whereas others, like Helen, feel rather that the company should have pushed back much harder against misinformation and teen epidemic claims instead of, quote, pleading for redemption. But as she wrote, how many more smokers would have made the switch if the war to destroy JUUL hadn't been waged? That is the real tragedy.
According to Public Health England, recently renamed the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities, vapes are at least 95% safer than smoking, and in the UK, vaping products are recommended by the National Health Service as an effective way to help people give up smoking. We decided it was time to revisit the situation in the UK, and so we asked John Summers, a UK consumer advocate, a few questions. Thank you, John, for joining us. Can you tell us what do you do and what is your area of interest?
Sure. So my name's John Summers. I'm a consumer advocate from the UK. I work in IT for a wealth management company, and I've worked in IT for nearly 30 years. But previous to that, my area of study was chemistry. So I have a bit of a scientific geeky background. I'm a dad and a husband, and I do a lot of volunteer work with other health organisations, and I've done work with Public Health England, the National Centre for Smoke Cessation Training, and Stop Smoking Bristol. Help not so much from a stop smoking perspective, but from the perspective of helping people get the right information about vaping, electronic cigarettes, and other safer nicotine products as well. In some cases, working with some really quite heavily entrenched smokers, people that are struggling to quit or switch, or whatever they choose to do. My approach was met with some interest by some of the old guard smoking cessation people. But there you go. I've never worked in the vape industry, never worked for a tobacco company, etc., etc. I'm just an interested party. I switched accidentally, if you like, to vaping. I dual used for a couple of years very early on with the really rubbish products, the really early electronic cigarettes. And then after 2 years, I just happened to find a better tank, the right flavoury liquid, and without really realising it, that day stopped smoking. And that's, oh God, blimey, 13 odd years ago. So haven't looked back, haven't smoked since, which has had a massive impact on me and my family. In the year before I switched, I had chest infections and bronchitis about 5 times in a 12-month period. Since then, I think I've had a chest infection, apart from COVID, once. Which, okay, it to a lot of people is an anecdote, but to me personally and to my family, that's one heck of a difference.
So can you tell us what the situation is with vaping in England at the moment? Are there any rules about where and when you can vape, for example?
Legally, it's allowed everywhere, because vaping is not smoking. However, things are interpreted rather oddly. If you are in a workplace, for instance, 9 times out of 10, if you are wanting to use an electronic cigarette, you will be put in the same place as a smoker. Now, that is actually against the guidance of the UK Health and Safety Executive, who caution employers that doing so may actually put them at risk of being sued, because by putting the vapors, by order in the same place as a smoker, you're intentionally exposing that person to cigarette smoke, which the stop smoking community claim secondhand smoke, of course, is just as dangerous as smoking. So if that's true, you can't be pushing all of those people into the same place. And it's kind of the same in a lot of venues in the UK. So pretty much most pubs, shops, clubs, restaurants will treat electronic cigarette use in exactly the same way as smoking. So the common thing that you will see is a stop smoking sign that also says no electronic cigarettes. To the point that at one rugby stadium, I was stood a good 20 meters away from the nearest person in a completely open area venue with no signage that actually said you weren't allowed to use an electronic cigarette. The wind was howling past me. There was, not harming anyone. And suddenly I heard a shout, "You can't do that here." Pardon? I can't do what? That. What do you mean, vaping? Yeah, it's not allowed. Well, signs don't say so. The next thing I know, I was being frog marched out of the venue. I was banned. I was thrown out. Because they insisted that if I wanted to do that, I had to go and stand amongst all the smokers. Now, if I'd chosen to do that, that's fine. But was I going to be told that I had to go and do that? No. And because I said, no, I'm not happy to do that, I was thrown out. Now, that is against the Health and Safety Executive guidance. But it seems to be the common take. And it's because there are organisations like Healthy Stadia, like Fresh, etc. in the UK, who, despite the guidance from Public Health England, as was, and the National Centre for Smoking Cessation Training and Cancer Research and what have you. Their agenda is different, because theirs is about quitting nicotine, about not using anything, which, you know, moralistically maybe, you know, a great thing, but that's not it's not scientific. It's based around, well, we don't like it, we don't want people doing that, we don't agree with it. There are lots of things that people don't agree with. There are lots of things that people don't like. I don't like people shouting at me, for instance, across a stadium. I have PTSD. So somebody doing that to me is actually, and throwing me out of a rugby stadium, is incredibly damaging to me. And the attitude, you know, people's attitudes to that is, oh, well, you're just going to have to get on with it. Well, that's the same if I make a choice to do something that's not hurting someone in a public place. You know, if I'd been stood inside a room, okay, maybe, you know, what other people think may come into consideration. And certainly indoors, you know, in a bar or a restaurant or what have you, yes, the operator of the venue has the final decision. It's their space. Outdoors, no.
Okay.
You know, I have no more control over whether or not somebody vapes next to me, or smokes next to me, or swears next to me, or smells next to me.
If UK research says that vaping is a safer alternative for smoking who want to quit smoking than other replacement therapies, why do many people still smoke? And why do many of them believe that e-cigarettes are dangerous?
People will always do what they want to do. I mean, I know, you know, me initially, I was quite a, you know, geeky scientific type person. So when I saw, you know, all this stuff about electronic cigarettes, I went away and I did reading and you know, looked into whether or not this would work. But again, we've got this persistent media communication, of over egging and over exaggerating and misinterpreting the you know, what are quite often not scientific studies. They are press releases about a study that somebody would like to do, trying to attract funding, and actually they're then, you know, what's being said when you read into what's behind it is nonsense. And so that sort of stuff puts people off. Attitudes of organizations like Healthy Stadia, etc. But if you say to someone, right, you're not allowed to smoke here, but you are allowed to do that, straight away you send some really, really strong messages to that person, positive messages. It's worth switching. Why? Well, because I can do that thing without having to go outside or leave the venue or whatever. Okay, I can do that thing and still enjoy what it is that I'm wanting to do. I can still be socially involved with my mates, with what's going on. That must mean that it's okay to do this. So quite quickly, just a small change, you know, you have an area in a pub where you're allowed to vape. It's not hard. All you've got to have is an extractor fan or something like that. We used to do it. And in some pubs, you probably wish that they still did. Yeah, they sometimes smell of it, right? But straight away, you change that message. I've seen this negative messaging have some really strong impact. I mean, a few years ago, I was outside a hospital, and in Gloucester, where I live, and Gloucestershire NHS Trust policy is that vaping on the grounds is allowed. You're allowed to vape in the hospital grounds, not in the hospital itself, for fairly obvious reasons, because on most of the wards there's oxygen in use, and any sort of heating apparatus and oxygen is not a great combination. So yeah, we'll give them a pass on that one. But patients are allowed to use vapes within areas within the hospital and what have you. Anyway, I was outside this hospital using my electronic cigarette, and a lady came out, and she was, you could see she was incredibly ill. She was very pale. She had one of the stands with her with IV drips. She had about 3 IVs on there, and she wheeled herself just outside the doorway and started to smoke. And I kind of looked and thought, oof, you know, I'll leave that. And, you know, she's coughing and spluttering, and, you know, then she's having another cigarette, and, you know, just got chatting. I said, "Oh, bet you know, you're popular with them." "Oh, yeah, they don't like me doing it." "Well, have you thought about, you know, switching to something else?" And just, you know, got into a conversation with her about it. Had just got to the point where I had a couple of spare, you know, disposable type electronic cigarettes on me. Was just at the point of, yeah, okay, she's going to take, you know, she'll take one. And suddenly a voice from the side screams, "You can't do that here. It looks like smoking." So what? So what if it looks like smoking? It's not smoking. And this person's an incredibly heavy smoker who's already incredibly ill, and you've now destroyed that opportunity for that person to switch. That may result in that person's death. Who knows? And it was completely counter to the NHS Trust's policy. It was completely counter to the signage that was around, but it was their opinion, and their opinion was being fed by media, by organisations like the BMA, who still have this, "We don't really want to recommend it. We're going to allow our members to." The BMA is a union. It's not a medical authority. It's a union. The same as the, you know, the Royal College of Nurses. You know, it's not a regulatory body. It's not got responsibility for those things, but they're still doing this push for whatever reason. We can theorize as to what they may be, or just flat out, you know, ignorance and puritanism. But that attitude really diverts people away from potentially switching to whatever safer product that is. You know, people do the same thing with snus. "Oh, well, it's like chewing tobacco used to be." Well, actually, no, it's not. Nicotine pouches. "Well, yeah, it's just another way to get kids hooked." No, it's not. They don't like them. Vaping. Well, if people have disposable vapes and they chuck them down on the ground instead of disposing of them, you know, safe properly, yeah, kids probably are going to get hold of them. They shouldn't, but hey, what's the alternative? They smoke. I'll go with that one rather than the smoking. It might not be politically correct, but from a health perspective, they're going to have a much better outcome.
Thank you, John, for sharing your insights. We'll come back to you again in future episodes with some more questions. And now we go over to Brent Stafford and his guest, Brad Rodu. Brad is a professor of medicine and holds an endowed chair in tobacco harm reduction research at the University of Louisville. At the Global Forum on Nicotine in Warsaw last month, Brad was the recipient of the 2022 Michael Russell Award. The award is given to individuals who have made substantial and innovative contributions to the science and understanding of safer nicotine products and tobacco harm reduction. Thanks to his personal and professional dedication to the field over many decades and despite many challenges, Brad is a very worthy recipient. In today's interview, Brad shares his views about people's attitude to smoking, vaping, and nicotine. Over to you, Brent.
Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and welcome to another edition of Regwatch on GFN-TV. We're here in Warsaw, Poland for the Global Forum on Nicotine, GFN-22, and joining us in person is Dr. Brad Rodu. Brad, thanks for coming back on the show.
It's great to be back. with you.
So tell us, for viewers who don't know where you're from and what you do, fill us in.
Well, I'm a professor of medicine at the University of Louisville in Kentucky. I also hold an endowed chair in tobacco harm reduction research at the Cancer Center there. I've been conducting tobacco research and advocating for safer cigarette substitutes since 1994. That's 28 years.
How much of that time have you been on the outside?
Oh, for quite a bit of it. It's been a struggle to get this information across to smokers so that they can make choices that will impact their lives and their health.
So what was it then, I guess, was it from your medical experience that you witnessed some of the, ravaging that smoking does on the body?
That's right. I'm an oral pathologist, and I worked in a cancer center treating and making diagnoses under the microscope and clinically of many, many kinds of cancers and immunosuppressed cancer patients undergoing therapy. I saw lots of cancers and many of them in smokers, and at that point the 2-minute warning is over and folks are looking at death. And so that's what drove me to find a way to help smokers quit that didn't involve completely abstaining from all nicotine and tobacco products.
Now, does quitting smoking actually, prevent the cancer, or is it too late at some point?
Well, obviously, the more you smoke, the higher the risk, and the more chance that you're going to have a deadly disease. But to be honest with you, you can quit almost any time before you're 40 years of age and avoid almost all of the risks. That's not widely known, but that's what the data, that's what the statistics say. And so the sooner you quit, the better. But quitting at almost any age, and we've demonstrated this in research reports, quitting at almost any age does improve your chances as opposed to continuing to smoke at that age.
So say you're a 30, 35-year-old male, you've been smoking for 15, 20 years, you quit through nicotine vaping. Mm-hmm. Would you enjoy the same benefits as if you had just quit smoking altogether?
Well, of course, we don't have long-term epidemiologic studies of vaping. But from everything we know about the chemistry, about what's in the vape, we're pretty sure that the benefits are going to be lifelong and long-term with respect to the risk of picking up a smoking-related disease. We know that from studies of Swedish snus and American smokeless tobacco products that contain lots of nicotine but no smoke. We know that's a benefit to people who switch.
So we're here at the Global Forum on Nicotine, and of course this is its 9th year, I believe, or the 9th edition. So that's a lot of time spent on a conference and efforts focused around nicotine. Why such the effort around nicotine? Do people not understand nicotine and what it is?
Well, before I get to that question, 9 years, especially for American audiences, that's 3.6 million dead smokers. That's why we're here, and that's occurring all over the world. And that's why we need a worldwide effort to move smokers that can't quit or won't quit to safer products.
So what is it about this issue then that has so many people up in arms? It certainly appears the FDA doesn't share that view and WHO doesn't share that view.
Well, and as you said about nicotine, that's one of the problems. The overwhelming opinion by smokers and non-smokers, and including a lot of health professionals, is that nicotine is not only addictive, which it is, nicotine is the cause of many of the illnesses that smokers have high risks for. That is what's false. And that is what's frustrating, that FDA, which is the regulator of nicotine and tobacco, hasn't tried to correct that misinformation, especially with American smokers.
So is nicotine safe?
I think nicotine is about as safe as another widely consumed addictive drug called caffeine. It's available in coffee. There are lots of people addicted to it, but long-term consumption of caffeine results in virtually no serious health effects. That's what we know about nicotine. It's not the same drug. It doesn't affect the brain in the same way, but we think that the lack of serious health effects is almost equivalent to those of caffeine. And I've been saying this with no one pushing back since 1994.
So if you're an adult of majority age and you're not a smoker and you for some reason decided that you wanted to pick up a mild nicotine habit, is there anything wrong with that?
I don't see any major problem with people who find benefit from using nicotine in a smoke-free distribution system. I don't see a major impact with that. Not with all the other health concerns that health professionals worry about with respect to our patients.
You know, we hear all the time, and it's growing actually, the voices on this, is that nicotine harms developing brains.
Yes, we hear that. And my response has been that there's actually, outside of some animal models where they overload developing mice with big doses of nicotine, outside of that, there is virtually no human evidence that nicotine has affected brain development. And let me give you an example. We have 30 million adult smokers in the United States. We have somewhere about double that, 60, 70 million former smokers. It has never been shown anything clinically that those current or former smokers are different in any way from their non-smoking, lifelong non-smoking counterparts. There's no evidence for it at all. So how can they say the nicotine's affected their brain development? We have lots of ways to scan brains now, but no one's ever demonstrated any defect.
So how then can CDC, which does make this claim, and it's made by many government organizations that are involved in tobacco control, that nicotine harms developing brains? I mean, there's research I've just even seen recently in the last month coming out trying to establish some kind of cause and effect on this, when common sense shows that it can't be the case.
Well, I mentioned mouse models. There are also they also try to produce these effects in cells that are grown in laboratory conditions. And I can tell you, I've participated in some molecular biology research. You can take cells growing in a plate, you can torture them and make them do just about anything you want them to do. You can get anything, any impact you want. But when you do that in normal doses to the human, the entire human, you don't get those same cellular effects. And so I think all of that research is blown out of proportion for two reasons. Number one is to establish that nicotine is a demon drug. And number two, it's to get more and more funding. You have to make your research as relevant as you can so that you can get funded for the next grant and keep rolling in that funding stream. There's no credible evidence that nicotine causes cancer. Again, a lot of those studies are taking nicotine and isolating it in cells and trying to produce effects at the gene level or other effects that then they claim is relevant to the cancer development in humans. Take Swedish men. They're probably the highest prevalence of smokeless tobacco use, what we call snus, in the entire developed world. And they've been able to find virtually no impact on cancer incidence or cancer mortality among those men who use snus for a lifetime. So impacts in cells don't translate into impacts in humans, and that's what I believe we should be focused on.
Let's take a moment to discuss this conference, GFN. Why is it important to have an event like this?
Well, GFN is exciting because it's not just academics or professionals in tobacco control talking to each other. It's a lot of folks interested in tobacco harm reduction or safer substitutes, but they come from all directions. There are professionals here, but there are also consumers. Consumers need to play a role. The usual statement, nothing for us or about us.
Right.
That's very important. And I'm always excited to appear and to discuss these issues with the consumers that are being affected. Because that's, again, how I was brought into the issue. I was dealing with the patients, but it's too late. These consumers have used these products just in time.
Now, you were recognized last night with Dr. Mike Russell Award for your work in tobacco control. What did that mean to win that award?
Well, it was overwhelming. I've spent 28 years in this field, and as I indicated earlier, I came into the field as a pathologist who had had experience with the end results of a smoking career. In comparison to a lot of folks in tobacco control who are specialists with addiction medicine, psychiatry, psychology, public health, they have a different focus. It's a great focus, but they haven't seen as much of the end results as I have. So I always considered myself a little bit separate and never part of the usual groups of folks who tried to promote tobacco harm reduction. But this award last night, based on the grandfather of this concept, the visionary who saw this years before anyone else. He's a visionary that when I first published my first paper, and I was tobacco naive publishing this paper, I referenced in my articles because I knew who had the best research, and he did. And so I worshiped him like everybody else here did, and to have an award with my name in any way in the same universe as Michael Russell's name is just unbelievable.
One of the things the attendees here at GFN are struggling with is how to figure out a way to somehow bridge the divide within public health on this issue. Is there a divide, and what to do about it?
There is a divide, but the divide is still very lopsided. I mean, when I came into the field, I couldn't find collaborators or others that had the same interests in safer products. Now there is a small contingent of folks in many countries who are definitely interested in helping smokers switch. That's why this event is so important, because it brings together people and allows us to share ideas and plot where to go next. But it's still a very lopsided. When you say public health, I would have to say that the dominant numbers in public health are still very much against this. And that means all of the major medical societies, all in the US and Canada, all of the major governmental agencies. It's still a very, very lopsided affair. I think one of the major goals in the United States, and adopted it seems more and more in Canada, is this idea of a tobacco-free society. And the way the government funds that vision is it uses a fairly substantial budget at NIH, the National Institutes of Health, to fund academic researchers throughout the country. And mainly their goal is to find bad effects of any form of tobacco use. And right now the emphasis is on e-cigarettes and vaping. Now that's being supplemented by a transfer of somewhere around $200 to $300 million in tobacco user fees from FDA over to NIH to feed that pipeline. Now, when those researchers are funded for those effects, and it doesn't matter whether they had an original interest in tobacco or not, they take their research program and they adapt it to the tobacco resources and they get grants. And then the most prominent effect of those grants, the most prominent results are negatives against any tobacco use. And so that tends to promote more and more outrageous findings. Number one, to reach the media, and number two, to reach your next grant. And those outrageous findings even at times border on the fraudulent. And that's an area that we've had some activity with.
What do you mean fraudulent?
Well, I mean false results. Results that are simply not true.
From government-funded research?
Absolutely. And it's pervasive. And so if a person like me at a university wants to get other colleagues to participate in tobacco harm reduction research project of some sort, other investigators, most of whom are NIH funded, never want to risk alienating the funding agency, no matter what their research is, because they know what the NIH intentions are for tobacco. So it's a big problem, and it affects nearly all university research.
So is that then an inherent bias? The government seeks to pay for research that will support a preconceived position on this issue?
I think largely that's the case. Government funding supports negatives for tobacco research and has never been interested in a balanced approach toward these harm reduction products. Let me give you an example. In 1994, I published my first article basically suggesting that smokeless tobacco was less dangerous, less hazardous than cigarettes, and should be considered by smokers who are unable to quit. The National Cancer Institute, which is the largest of the NIH agencies, communicated to my university that this idea was unethical, that no one should be talking about this. And they indicated that I was unethical to be on the faculty. They challenged my faculty position in my university and challenged the university that this idea was not to be tolerated. And I don't think that mindset has changed in any way in the last 28 years. It drives everything at universities. And so it makes it very difficult for anybody who is balking at the main theme to get anywhere.
What is your advice, I think, for people attending this conference and those watching it online in terms of how to move forward to secure these kind of rights for consumers to have access to these tobacco harm reduction products?
Well, one thing we have to be vigilant is when a study's published, don't just read the headline. Because the headline is generated by the researcher who's NIH funded, is transferred to the university. Their media relations department always wants to get maximum exposure. And then the anti-tobacco crusaders always want to use that to drive down tobacco products. Don't pay attention to the headlines. The second thing that I'm trying to share with participants here is that we need some sort of post-publication review that's systematic. And I'm not just talking about reading the paper and trying to find minor issues. I'm talking about taking their data, the data they used, and conducting a new analysis that checks it. Because when we did that with several studies now, we've come up with major problems. And we've had published letters to editors at journals, and the journal editors are very reluctant to change their decisions based on a challenge after publication. But we have a couple in process right now. As you know, we took care of an especially egregious study claiming that vaping causes heart attacks, which was completely invalid, completely fraudulent, because those heart attacks had occurred 10 years before those participants picked up an e-cigarette. So that's the kind of review, that's the kind of work that has to be done to keep this anti-vaping crusade in check.
Thank you, Brent and Brad, for an interesting discussion. That's all for today. Thanks for watching, and see you next time for more tobacco harm reduction updates and Brent's forthcoming interview with Marwa Glover, who has worked on reducing smoking-related harm for over 25 years. Thank you and goodbye.